Often when engineers are talking about compression, what a lot of people don't realize is they're actually talking about downward compression. Downward compression is basically the most common form of compression that we use in a mix, and that's when something passes a threshold and gets turned down and ultimately evens things out, makes loud sounds quieter and makes quieter sounds louder in the process. Now, what a lot of people also don't realize is downward compression is just one of many forms of compression that are useful in a mix, and another one that doesn't really get a lot of attention is upward compression. Well, luckily for you, in today's video, I'm going to talk all about upward compression and how you can incorporate it into your mixes to sound better today. Are you ready? Let's go. What's going on, ladies and gentlemen? This is your boy 5-Piece producer and engineer extraordinaire. Thank you for checking out today's video, and I think a cool place to start is to first define the difference between upwards and downward compression, and the name of each really summarizes it quite well. Downward compression, as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, is when a signal passes a threshold, and anything that passes that threshold ultimately gets pushed downwards, gets reduced in volume or attenuated, and ultimately it basically takes these louder signals, these louder sounds that are in a mix and reduces them in volume. But in the process, what we typically do is we add some makeup gain to ultimately bridge the gap between the two. And what ultimately happens is the loud sounds come down in volume, but then the quiet sounds increase in volume as a result of that makeup gain. Now that is downward compression. This is the most common form of compression that everybody uses, and when people are talking about compression, that is really what they are referring to. But another type of compression, the one that we're going to focus on in today's video, is upwards compression, and upwards compression works in a slightly different way. Now, like I said, downward compression focuses on taking a signal that passes a threshold and reduces it. Well, upward compression does the opposite. What it does is instead, you set a threshold just like you would on a downward compressor, but anything that does not pass that threshold gets turned up in volume. So we're not talking about adding makeup gain or anything here. All that happens is signals that are too loud ultimately don't get changed. They don't reduce in volume at all. They stay exactly where they are, unaffected. But then signals that do not pass that same threshold are ultimately increased in volume. So as you can imagine, what happens is the quieter parts of a mix or of a sound get increased in volume, and it just helps it stand out more. And there's really a few different situations where I would use upward compression. Would I use it on everything? Probably not, but I would use it on some specific tasks or activities or goals that I have in a mix to ultimately achieve a better sound, and I want to break them down for you right now. Before I get into that though, I wanted to ask if you could please like and subscribe to the channel, like this video if you can, and leave a comment down below if you like what you see and if you want to see anything in the future. You guys doing that really means a lot to me. It helps my channel reach more people, helps me help more people in the process, and it also helps me help you because I'm doing this 100% for free. This is the only small ask that I have, so please like the video, subscribe to the channel when you can, and I'd really appreciate that. But let's talk about these three different situations where you'd want to use upward compression. Now, the first way you'd want to use upwards compression is to add some life to dull sounds. In a way, you actually want to use it to replace an EQ. So instead of going in with an EQ and boosting things, you're going to use upwards compression to ultimately enhance certain parts of the frequency or the whole sound if you want, to ultimately make it a little bit more, energetic or full of life. That's the first situation. The second situation you want to use a upward compressor on is if you have a track that is pretty much squashed and really compressed, hyper compressed, and you want to add some more life to it as a whole. An example of this would be a 2-track beat if you're mixing vocals over a 2-track beat that a producer already mixed. Now, the third situation, much like the second, is you'd want to use upward compression when mastering a song to ultimately increase the overall loudness and the perceived loudness of a song. Because like I said, it's going to take the quieter elements in a mix and help them cut out a little bit more in terms of volume without reducing the louder parts of the mix at all. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to open up 3 different examples that help accentuate these 3 points that I just made, these 3 situations, so that you know exactly how to use this in your mix or what to listen for in order to identify whether whether or not you should incorporate it yourself. So let's jump on to Ableton here. I'm actually switching it up today from my usual Pro Tools, although Pro Tools will be coming out shortly. And let's take a look at this track. We're going to specifically focus on this rim sound that I have in a mix. I'll play a quick little snippet of it so you know what we're dealing with. And we're listening for this rim sound. All right, and before I even show you what I did, I'll just get rid of my upward compression and I'll just play it and I'll put it in, and you could just listen and see if you hear a slight difference. This isn't going to be a huge difference, but it is going to be just a little bit more consistent and impactful in my opinion. So check this out. I'll play it without it and then I'll put it in halfway through. All right, let me put it in context without it. Like I said, it's very subtle, but what I'm doing here is I'm using a Pro MB, a FabFilter Pro MB, and I'm specifically isolating a specific frequency band being about 2200 to 9000 hertz on this rim. If I were to just solo it and play it. So it's kind of like the stick part of the rim, right, that we're getting. And you can use this Pro MB as a normal compressor, but I'm actually using it as an upward compressor. And the way I'm doing that is I'm actually adding a positive range. So the range, instead of pulling a sound down and the range capping it, I'm actually forcing the range upwards, which then adds volume. As you can see, this whole channel, this whole signal is completely flat. It's at 0. But then up top here in this frequency pocket, we are adding this volume, and what's happening is when I play this, you're going to see that this band is essentially increasing the volume of that frequency range, but then when the snare actually hits and passes this preset threshold that I have, right, it obviously doesn't add, it actually just brings it back down to 0. So it's not actually reducing it. If I had a negative range, it would reduce it. But instead, it's just bringing it back to 0. It's basically not affecting it at all, right? So pay attention and just watch what happens with this band every time the rim here hits. So really, in a way, what's happening is the actual attack, the transient of the hit, isn't being pulled up. It's not adding, really. It's just coming down, right? Or it's not coming down. It's just staying the same, neutral. But then the sustain of the rim is actually what kind of comes up. And I've also set my attack and release here to be very quick for the situation. So these parameters are very similar. It's exactly the same really as a downward compressor, but the difference is what it's affecting and how it's affecting it. So in this case, it's allowing the transient of the snare to just remain unaffected. When I say snare, I mean rim, but it allows it to be unaffected. But then the sustain, the part after the transient, that's sort of coming up, and it's creating a little bit more consistency in my mind. And again, I'm doing this very subtly. I don't want to go super crazy with this because you can create a very noticeable type of effect, maybe even a pumping type of sound, which is very common with compression in general. But I do like this for adding a little bit more life to certain sounds. In this case, I'm doing it with a rim, but you could do it with anything, keys, kick drums, all that kind of stuff. So hopefully this makes sense, but let's move into the second example that I talked about. Okay, so I got the second example here, and this is another beat that I did, but it's just the 2-track because obviously a lot of us that are recording on tracks, we're usually dealing with 2-track beats from a producer, and sometimes these tracks are really overcompressed, squashed, and you want to add a little bit more life to them. I'm actually going to show you 2 different examples here. Much like the last example, you could tell I was very frequency specific. Well, on this one, I'm going to actually show you how I've basically enhanced a couple of key frequency pockets on this particular beat, and then I'll actually show you a second example where I'm actually doing it across the whole beat, the whole frequency range of the beat, and show you the difference between them. Now, let's do this first one with the specific frequencies that are isolated. Now, like I said, you want to use this in a way where you're replacing additive EQ. So instead of going for an EQ and enhancing certain frequency ranges, you could do this instead. And it's really cool because it allows you to enhance that frequency, but then when that frequency is too loud and essentially passes the threshold, it doesn't add anything, right? It's kind of a cool little way to, again, enhance and make things a little bit more, vibey, energetic, have some more feeling in them, right? So let me just unbypass this And let's see what this sounds like. Okay, this is with my frequency specific changes between, let's say, 30 and 100 hertz, 155 and 479, 2200 and 7400, and 11,500 to the very top end, which is about 30K, I believe. Yeah. So here we go. Check this out. I'll play without it and put it in. Again, it is a little bit more subtle, so hopefully you can really hear what's happening here. But when I don't have this in, it's definitely more dynamic, right? You're getting a little bit more of the kick action. You know, you can really feel that movement. And even if I just look at this track, right, like it's still fairly dynamic, right? It's not super compressed, but when I zoom out like this, it starts to look a little bit like an audio sausage, right? And this track, to be fair, I do have mastering on it. That's why I'm using this on purpose, to show how you may need to address this, because 9 times out of 10, the beats that you are going to be getting from producers are mastered, the 2-track beats, of course. So when I put this in, these frequency bands are essentially enhancing specific pockets across the whole spectrum, right? So if I were to just solo each one, so, you know, just adding a little bit of sub, right? But you could see that whenever the sub is happening, it's kind of coming down on the attack, but then allowing some of the release to come back. And if we look at the specific settings, I have a bit of a slower attack so that it's not going to clamp down so much. It's not really going to clamp down, but it's going to actually enhance the attack as well, just a little bit, right? Check this out.
5.
See, the reaction time is a little bit slower. It's not pulling it down right away. It's kind of waiting, and then it's coming back down to 0, right? So it's really, again, enhancing the sustain of the track in a way, or the sustain of the sub, I should say. Up here, I'm going to definitely assume that we are focusing a little bit more on these low mids, the kick, for example. Let's check this out. A little bit more of the articulation of the kick. It's not perfect because, again, we're dealing with a 2-track here. Having the stems would obviously be the ideal scenario, but again, I'm imagining that you're not going to have access to that. So let's see what's happening here on this one. I got a bit of a faster attack and a faster release. And just so you guys know, all these is only being boosted by 1 dB. So I'm not cranking it by 6 or 10. I'm not doing a crazy boost here. I'm doing a slight boost to just add some more movement and consistency within the track. So let's see how this one's reacting.
5.
So you can see it's not really adding too much, but it is adding things here and there. Again, the attack is fast, so it's bringing it back down to neutral, 0 in this case, unaffected, right? Pretty consistently, but then certain snare hits, accent snare hits, kick hits, stuff like that, it's going to just enhance them again, a little bit more of the sustain more than the attack itself. Let's look at this frequency band. So a little bit more of the, you know, higher end, sizzly sort of area in a sense, or presence, I should say. And settings on this are very much the same as the last one. Faster attack and release.
5.
And you can hear whenever that sort of pan sound is happening, that's when it's coming back down to 0. But otherwise, it's kind of enhancing the frequency, or the instrumental frequency pockets, I should say, there. You know, the steel pan, stuff like that. And then this top end, let's see what this is doing. So this is really just air, right? Air and presence that we're adding here, just to try to get a little bit more clarity. And I like doing this instead of actually just doing a shelf boost, because again, when you boost a shelf overall, it could create some problems. It could create some harshness and some other just issues you don't want to deal with. Whereas this, it's not happening all the time. It's sort of situational. It's dynamic, right? It happens when it needs to be boosted, but then when the signal passes the threshold, it's not going to be adding that frequency anymore, and it's going to be just leaving it at neutral, 0, where it was before you added this processing. And again, very similar to before, faster attack and release, 1 dB range, and each of these thresholds is being set uniquely so that I'm getting the reaction. You have to sort of use your ears and decide. There's not just one set threshold that you're going to use. You're going to have to just dial it in. So if we just pay attention here, let's pay attention to the threshold especially and see how I set this.
5.
And you can see that it's adding a bit more than it's leaving it neutral, right? As you can see, we're not passing the threshold, and therefore anything that doesn't pass the threshold, again, that stuff that's not passing the threshold is getting increased in volume, right? But then when something passes the threshold, that's when the upward compressor, in this case, brings it down to neutral, 0. It doesn't affect it at all, right? So pay attention one more time.
5.
Very subtle. It's like we're just sort of tipping it and then it's getting the reaction. But overall, this one might be the most transparent of all in a way. So that's if I was to do this with specific frequency pockets. And as you can tell, I've sort of decided to isolate specific frequencies and do this additive approach here using the upward compressor. Well, what if you don't have the Pro MB where you can do this? What if you have a upward compressor? Because there's a lot of them that, just does it as a whole, right? Well, that's where this example comes into play. This is me now increasing the overall track. And what I've done is, because this is the whole track, the threshold has to be set, pretty lightly. It can't be clamping down really quick. You know what I mean? So I have the threshold set to essentially the highest it could be, right? Where the signal doesn't or has the least chance of passing it, right? 0 dB in this case. The range here, I'm actually adding 2. So I'm adding a little bit more because the bass, the drums, that's going to obviously surpass the threshold pretty quickly and cause it to trigger. And it's going to create a bigger reduction, especially on these higher end sounds, right? These higher frequency sounds that maybe I want to enhance even more. So I'm adding a 2 dB range, which is obviously adding 2 decibels of gain in a sense for anything that doesn't pass the threshold. And then because this is on the entire master, I have my attack being relatively slow and my release being pretty much the fastest it could be. You may want to actually bump it back just a little bit, just so that way you don't get any sort of distortion, because sometimes that happens with quick release times. But let's just see how this is sounding. I'll play it without it and I'll put it in halfway through.
5.
So you see it's not fully adding 2 dB the entire time. It's obviously adding maybe just a little bit, like a 0.5 to a 1 maybe. You know what I mean? In fact, if I actually were to just reduce this to a 3 dB view, let's see one more time and see where we're hitting.
5.
So yeah, it's adding about 1 to 1.5 actually. I thought it was less than that, but 1 to 1.5. And as you can see, I am clipping a little bit, right? So I would recommend, of course, if this is happening to you, you could change the range, but I like what's happening here. So instead I might just change the output volume. So I would try to match whatever it is we are exceeding the signal by. That's a small number. In this case, it's 0.6. So let's see. This should now be hitting perfect 0, hopefully. And if it doesn't, I can go down another 0.1 dB, right? So check this out.
5.
So we're not clipping, that's good. And let's just do one more A/B, because now that we have this output reduced, it might change how things flow. Check this out. So without it and then with it.
5.
Very interesting. I'm always amazed with how, when you do this effectively, it really brings life to a record without, completely causing it to clip and distort and sound all sorts of messed up, right? And that's why this third example is going to make a lot of sense, because now we're going to talk about how I would use this in more of a mastering situation to increase the level of an overall track with vocals and everything. So let's check that out. All right, so here's the third example, and this is in the context of an actual mastering session. So this is a session with all the 2 tracks that I've sequenced out, and now, I've done my processing and all that. But we're going to specifically focus on this one song. It's from an artist named Sorry. It's called You Need Time to Heal. I'll leave a link below. Great record, great album, great artist. So in this particular case, I'm actually, again, using this on a mastering situation. Let me actually get rid of my upward compression. This is the chain, but I'm using the C1 gate, believe it or not, as an upward compressor, which is actually possible. You can set up a positive floor, right? So instead of things coming down and being reduced, it's going to essentially bring it up, right? So I'm actually using an expander in a way as an upward compressor. And if you're curious, you can just go to the load on the C1 and, select the upward compressor preset and then adjust it to taste. That's what I did here. I think it's a little bit more aggressive when you use the preset. I think I've dialed this down so it's not as aggressive. But I'm going to play this first and just listen without it and listen with it and particularly pay attention to the drums.
You need time to heal. I painted pictures in my head of different things you had. Confidence. It's hard to get back when traps being thrown in your vision while wearing blindfolds over blindfolds. Man, they aiming for your head. It's not your fault you couldn't catch on while being stepped on to the destruction that they already said.
All right, so hopefully you heard it, but the drums, they just sound a little bit louder, a little bit more consistent, and there's just more definition, especially on the kick and that rim style of snare, And as you can see here, I've actually done a whole bunch of processing leading into it, and I still have some stuff happening after, by the way, but I'm using this gate towards the end of my chain to essentially just drive up the volume. And you can see when I bypass it how much of a difference it makes. Now, what if I just bypass all of these other sounds or plugins after, which is basically a clipper and a few maximizers to, drive the level up. But let's just see how this sounds without it and with it. So without it.
You need time to heal. I painted pictures in my head of different things you had. Confidence. It's hard to get back when traps being thrown in your vision while wearing blindfolds over blindfolds. Man, they aiming for your head. It's not your fault you couldn't catch on while being stepped on to the destruction that they already said. You make your...
So even without the, stuff that drives the volume up, the limiting and stuff that happens after, you're still hearing the difference. Again, it's creating a little bit more consistency. And like I said at the beginning, this is really good at helping quieter parts or quieter elements in your track come up. And this, unlike the Pro MB where I could isolate specific frequencies, this is happening across the entire spectrum of the frequency range of this track. And again, you can see how it's just driving the volume up, creating more definition, but at the same time, it is sacrificing the dynamics just a little bit because as I was sort of saying before, the louder sounds are being unaffected. It's basically staying at zero, and then it's taking the quieter sounds and increasing them in volume. So what's happening here is loud sounds stay the same, quieter sounds come up, and that results in the same sort of effect that you get with compression. And as I may have mentioned in other videos, compression can be dangerous in a sense that it could really suck the life out of a record. It can make it sound squashed and lifeless. But I find that when you are using it on individual frequency bands, like I did with the Pro MB before, it obviously helps just create a little bit more movement because now we're enhancing, the bass, the sub, the kick, or the really high end, or just specific sounds within the actual track that you're affecting. Hopefully that makes sense. Now, I'm using a gate here, like I said. I don't think it's really important to fully go over the settings, but you can see that I'm essentially just adding a 2 dB of volume on stuff that is too quiet. If you actually pay attention to this, little ticker thing here, you're going to see that when it comes up to a certain point, it sort of increases, and this yellow bar is showing the positive increase. If it was red, it would actually be showing how much it's being reduced by. So check this out. Let's pay attention here.
You need time to heal. I painted pictures in my head of different things you had.
So essentially, it's here, but then, once it kind of hits this floor where it's too quiet, where it's too low, it's essentially boosting it so it goes even higher. But then when it gets too high, it obviously brings it back down to zero. It's not adding anything at all. Now, this is just one of several plugins you could use for this. I'm using the C1 here. The Pro MB is another great plugin that you can use. I actually prefer to use that one for my upward compression duties. There's also the Waves MV2, I believe it's called. There's so many. It doesn't really matter what you use. What matters is the intention. And here I am showing you 3 different situations where you may want to use upwards compression. This is the situations that I would use it in. Do I use it all the time? Absolutely not. I use it certain moments where I think it's appropriate to achieve a certain result, but I just want to show you an alternative to standard downward compression that we're also used to hearing about and using in our mixes. So I hope you found this helpful. If you did, please like and subscribe to the channel. Like this video, smash that like button until it turns blue. Drop a comment. Let me know what you thought. Let me know what you want to see in a future video. I appreciate you guys for watching as always, and I'm looking forward to helping you guys again in a future video. Y'all take care now. Peace.
5.